Are you shopping for a Class D amplifier and noticed that two new models were recently released, but you're not sure which one is right for you? Well, my name is Aaron, and I thought it would be helpful to compare the new Aiyima A70 and Douk Audio A100 amplifiers to help you make that decision. Now, spoiler alert, I think one of these amps can be a little weird. But before I tell you why, we need to first talk about how these amps are similar. Here's the good news. Both of these amps actually have a lot of things in common. For instance, they both use the TPA3255 amplifier chip. They both have 48 volt 5 amp power supplies. They both have swappable op amps for those of you who like to roll op amps. And they're both retailed at $200. They also both implement PFFB technology, which basically reduces distortion and improves overall sound quality. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I think one of these amplifiers can be a little weird, and I'll go ahead and give you a hint. It's the one that I think kind of looks like a car amplifier. Now, that might be a little harsh, but there are a lot of features that make the A100 an odd little amp, which I'll explain in further detail in just a few minutes. Now, if you find this video helpful and you'd like to support my channel, you can do so by becoming a member by clicking on the link in the description box below. Now, we got to talk about the features of both of these amps because there's actually a lot of differences that we need to cover. Now, power is always a major consideration when buying one of these Class D amplifiers, and as these are being released more and more frequently, the options for power supplies and ratings are varying so much, it's hard to go over every possible option in these videos. Just note that both of these come with a 48 volt 5 amp power supply and are going to provide more than enough power for your average consumer. Now, the A70 Pro is a balanced amplifier, which means it offers both RCA and XLR inputs, while the A100 only offers RCA inputs. The A70 can only be used in stereo mode, but the A100 has several mode options, something I'll touch on here again in just a few minutes. The A70 uses a RCA connection for the sub out, while the A100 uses a 3.5mm aux. Each amp has its own unique way of dialing in subwoofer performance, with the A70 offering a variable filter on the rear of the unit and also allowing for the sub volume to be controlled by the volume knob. I'll need a minute to better explain the A100 sub operation further, so just stick with me a little longer. Now finally, because the A70 has both XLR and RCA inputs, they offer an RCA gain switch which adds 3 decibels, which is something the A100 does not really need to include, given the only input it offers is RCA. So why do I find the A100 kind of weird? At first, I just thought the A100 was a regular amplifier, but the more you look at the front of the unit and, most importantly, read the manual, the more you realize this little guy can be used in many different configurations. For instance, you can use it as a mono amp for a passive sub. You could use it in a traditional 2.0 and 2.1 setup. You could even use it in like a 2.2 system, which requires you to buy 2 of the amplifiers. And one of those amps will power a passive sub, and the other is going to power your speakers and allow that pass through to an active sub like you would do in a traditional 2.1 system. Now, this is where things get a little confusing when using the A100, and I've even seen some other reviewers get this a little confused. Using this switch, when pressed down to sub, at which point you can use these knobs here, subwoofer frequency and super bass, to fine-tune the sub's performance. Now, I don't have a passive subwoofer, so this operation was not tested for my review. But if you are using this in flat mode, which I suspect most people will do, it bypasses these knobs, and now the subwoofer is connected via the aux output and is now controlled by these knobs here, which means the subwoofer frequency and super bass knobs are not needed. You now have a normal volume knob for your speakers, and then you also have this volume knob here dedicated to your sub. My head is spinning. Now, I'm not saying that Douk Audio shouldn't have offered all of these options on the A100. It's just that after having reviewed over 20 Class D amps at this point for the last few years here on YouTube and answering a lot of questions from people that can get a little confused when setting up these Class D amplifiers in their new systems at home. I just think a lot of people are going to get confused by all these different configurations being offered in one amplifier, especially how these knobs will function in a normal 2.0 or 2.1 operation. And to be honest with you, that's why I think this amp is a little weird. So do these amplifiers sound different? Well, keep in mind, they're both using the TPA3255 amp chip. They both implement the PFFB technology. They're both dead quiet. I didn't hear any noise. So it's not really easy to choose one or the other based on performance. Honestly, I think your normal average consumer would sit down and a blind test would prove that they can't really hear the difference. As these Class D amplifiers continue to be released with the same chips and the same technology, you really trick yourself into think you're hearing that much of a sound difference. So the good news is when you're trying to choose between the A70 and the A100, you don't have to bother about choosing one that might sound better than the other. It's really going to come down more to features. Now, what you could argue is because of some of the added extra sub features on either of these, that you could better dial in a sub performance, which might make one feel more musical than the other, especially in the lower bass region. But overall, just generally speaking, you're not going to hear that major of a sound difference between the two. So which one of these amplifiers do I think you should buy? Well, before I tell you, I really would love to know what your opinion is. Even if you're not shopping for an amplifier and you were looking at either of these, does one stand out more than the other? Please let me know in the comments below. Now first, it's worth pointing out that because of all these different mode operations with the A100, we're not really doing a fair apples to apples comparison between these two amplifiers. Second, given that the sound qualities are so similar between these two amplifiers, especially in a 2.0 or 2.1 configuration, it's really going to come down more to a decision on features rather than sound. That means that if you just want an easy to use stereo amplifier that pairs well with an active subwoofer, the A70 is an excellent choice for you. However, if you are someone who is looking for an amp to power a passive subwoofer only, you would want the A100. You would also want the A100 if you want to power a passive sub and also buy another A100 to power your regular 2.0 or 2.1 system. Of course, if you just want to power a standard 2.0 or 2.1 system with an active sub, the A100 can be used. Just keep in mind some of the sub options offered on the front aren't applicable. So in short, if you're just looking for something simple and easy to use, the A70 is a great option. However, if you are someone who loves a lot of features and having multiple amps powering multiple components in your system to fine-tune everything to your liking, then the A100 might make the most sense for you, especially if you don't mind buying more than one. Well, speaking of Douk Audio and feature-packed items, they recently released a DAC with 2 separate DAC chips included within and allows you the opportunity to swap back and forth between the two based on your preference. If you'd like to learn more about the DAC Q11, you can do so by watching this video here.